Memory. What has memory to do with enlightenment? Hello, this is Chris speaking, Shores of Infinity, with another video about enlightenment and what Sri Aurobindo has to say about it in his book, The Life Divine. He dedicates 2 whole chapters to the topic or the problem of memory. Chapter 8 and 9 of Book 2. The first one is called Memory, Self-Consciousness and Ignorance. The second one, Memory, Ego and Self-Experience. I will cover them in one go. And it's actually interesting for everyone, even if you're not interested in Sri Aurobindo or the Life Divine. One very interesting thing that usually happens on the path to enlightenment is that memory gets weaker. We start to forget things. There seems to be something wrong with our memory, especially after enlightenment has happened, and especially with people to whom full enlightenment has happened. Memory doesn't work very well anymore. This at first is discombobulating, confusing, worrying, but then after a while it becomes clear that it must be so. There's no other way, because memory is one of the main functions to keep our ego state in place, to keep our Maya identification and obsession in place. Memory is what makes our narrative believable. There is something like collective memory, which we could call karma, or memory of Maya, again, which we call karma, fate, destiny. And then there is individual memory, which we can call the narrative of the self, the narrative of the ego. The story that you tell yourself and others all the time about what happened so far. It's like reading a novel or watching a movie. And you have to repeat that story again and again and again to yourself and others to continue believing in it. So once you stop believing in it, which is basically enlightenment, then of course the memory wanes. It loses its grip because you have seen that it doesn't make sense actually. It's not the memory of facts, it's the memory of a story, of an illusion, of something fabricated. Especially the timeline. Memory has something to do with time and cause and effect. And those are the 2 things that really got us by the short and curlies. Time and cause and effect. Those are what makes memory and what makes our sense of self believable. But what happens in enlightenment is that you stop believing in a linear time and you stop believing in cause and effect. So, of course, there is no structure anymore, there is no framework, there is no shelf anymore for memory. Memory needs a structure. It needs some kind of pattern, some kind of scale in which to put all the little pieces of information. Once that framework is gone, you don't know anywhere where to put it. It's like having no shelves and no cupboards in your rooms. Then you have to put it somewhere on the floor, and maybe you can't find it anymore later. And also you find out that most things you wanted to memorize before are actually not important. Yes, you do need to make notes about certain appointments, but you can write them down, you don't have to memorize them. Usually all the intellectual facts you were so interested in and proud of before, whatever you're doing, if you're an engineer or a historian or I don't know what, whatever you were proud that you could remember very well beforehand, it also stops making sense to have all that accessible. For what? You're not thinking anymore anyway. That's the thing with enlightenment. Unless you really want to, there's no thinking happening. in your mind. Interestingly, my experience is when you and if you want to access that information, it's usually possible to access it. You think you have forgotten, but it's there. You can still access or download it if you really need it, most of the time. Of course, having a wonky memory can make you appear a little bit like a nutty professor, but that's actually also what enlightened people are somehow, minus the professor, just nutty. Why? Because enlightened people don't take anything seriously that most people do take very seriously. So that is of course a form of craziness somehow. From the viewpoint of most people who are not enlightened, from the viewpoint of an enlightened person, that's of course not crazy, that's the only form of being sane. So Sri Aurobindo explains very well how memory actually keeps ignorance and self-consciousness in place, how it keeps time and karma and space and all these things that we take for granted, that is so very difficult to doubt with the mind, into place. It keeps the duality in place. It keeps the ignorance in place. It convinces us that meaningless facts are knowledge. But in actual fact, like the ancient Greeks already had discovered, only intuitive knowledge is real knowledge. Everything else is just descriptions. Descriptions of illusion. The world is empty and meaningless, and we give it meaning. We ourselves give it meaning and thus participate in Maya. Voluntarily. We voluntarily participate in the illusion that we profess that we want to get rid of, that is so painful. The Buddha has also talked about it at length. The world is suffering, and we can stop it, but usually we don't want to stop it because it's so suspenseful. We want to know how the story ends. What we call our mind is actually many kinds of mind, and we use only one part of this, or very few parts. We are also mental beings. We are physical beings, subtle beings, and mental beings. But we usually only of our mental being use very few capacities, functions, faculties. And one of them is memory. Also this perceiving time, perceiving space, perceiving the body, perceiving energy, all those are mental functions of our mind at large. But we usually use these faculties of our mind as a crutch. We could fly, soar like birds in the sky, but we limp around on crutches. The door out of duality is to stay in the present moment and not to go to wander off with our minds into the past or into the future, which is difficult. Eckhart Tolle has talked about it for years, and it has turned out that only hearing about it doesn't make it happen. Very few of his millions of followers have managed to stay in the present moment, although they have listened to hundreds of his talks and read his books and so on. What we are adventurers. We are adventurers of time, space, and causality. We want to find out what they're about, and we somehow have gotten lost in that exploration and forgot that that was our plan. We have identified with the subjects of our research. This is something that often happens to researchers like sociologists and psychologists and cultural anthropologists. It's very easy to get lost in the subject you research and identify with it or them, and then you're not objective anymore. This reminds me of the Monty Python's movie The Life of Brian. Watch it or rewatch it if you don't know it or if you haven't watched it for a long time. It's actually a very good rendition of everyone's life. It's weird stuff is happening, and it's kind of getting out of control. And this is because of our belief in certain things like time, space, and causality, and cause and effect. Cause and effect is at the root of most of our illusions. While from a causal point of view, actually nothing has to do with anything. Cause and effect is a law that does not necessarily have to apply to everything. There are laws. Everywhere there are laws. There are laws in the courtroom, there are laws in a football game, rules we call them. Everywhere there are laws and rules and norms. And once you believe in them, you're subject to them. If you don't believe in them, you're not subject to most of them. As long as you stay connected to your body, that's important, not to lose connection to your body. Otherwise, you will just go off into another kind of illusion with your mind. The mind likes to wander, it likes to exchange one illusion for another. That's why we have the body as an anchor. You probably have wondered already why we need to feel pain, why the body needs to feel pain. Is that really necessary? Yes, it is, because it's linked to a very important physical, instinctual sensation of that's good for me and that's not good for me. And it's important to be in contact with that. Enlightenment is not about ignoring the body. It's about being in contact with all these little functions of the body, the subtle, the mental, and later the supramental. One thing that makes it tricky is that not only is there a memory of this lifetime, there's a memory of something that seems to be other lifetimes as well. Again, we call it karma. So what is this all about? There is a stream, a flowing stream of experience. It's just not linear. That's basically the problem, that we see time and causality in a linear way. There is something like time and causality, but not in a linear way. This is also something Buddha has talked about it a lot. Also, reincarnation in Buddhism is very different. It's not that the reincarnations are in a linear time. What we have here again is the usual technique of Maya to convince us by repetition. Repetition is one of the main tools of magic, of stage magic, trick magic, and also things like advertisements and so on, to convince people of something. Repetition. If you hear or see something often enough, you start to believe in it. The sense of ego, the sense of I, is also not a real problem. It's not something evil. It's a preparation. It's preparation what is to come. First we play around a little bit with this ego thing, and then at some point we can let it go and something much larger, on a larger scale and more complex will happen, but also more simple. We're spending a lot of time on the surface, and as Jed McKenna points it out all the time, it's like what we're usually doing is like an extended childhood. It's time to become adult, to wake up and become a human adult. And this whole ego phase that is so vilified in the spiritual scene and marketplace is actually what we can call childhood and adolescence. Just at some point we have to stop, but we are so involved, so engrossed, so absorbed by it and its own momentum that we find it hard to stop. If you have children, you will be able to observe that around the age of 20, when you think, okay, now they will finally grow up, hopefully, they don't. there is a huge resistance of children to take responsibility on their own. Unless, of course, the parents have either been very encouraging or very discouraging. If they have been very encouraging, then they probably will be ready to become adults sooner. And if they have been very discouraging, then it can be that this also drives you into playing an adult very soon. But that's only playing an adult. Now, once you have a job and maybe children of your own, it feels adult, but not in a spiritual sense. Because we still believe in the same stuff that we have believed as children and as adolescents. The memory of our childhood and our adolescence is the basis for everything else. Well, in actual fact, it was just a game to prepare us what is coming next. But we have forgotten that it is a game and think that is the basis, and now we're limited by this. You're not limited. You can do whatever you like. Instead, we have all these excuses. Well, I can't do that because of this and this and this and that, what happened in my past. No, that has nothing to do with it. There is no causality there. There is no cause in the past that determines who you are and what you're doing now. Only the identification with the narrative is what holds you back. The memory and the identification with the memory, the surface consciousness. What holds us back to go deeper, to delve deeper? Fear. And what is the fear based upon? Our memory of stuff that was uncomfortable before. So it's all coming back to this memory thing. And unfortunately, as I have talked about in the simulacra and simulation video, our mind often cannot distinguish between a real memory and things like dreams, movies, pictures, and so on. So quite often these memories are not even our memories, but it's memorized as if they were our memories. To get out of this conundrum, all you have to do is stop believing in it. You don't have to fix anything in your past first. Just stop believing that this is fact. What is fact is that in the present moment you're thinking about the past. That's all. There is no real causality. You're creating it by remembering, by repeating this remembering gimmick. It's a self-hypnotization. Okay, let's leave it there for today. Thank you to all my patrons. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Give it a rating if you liked the video, and see you soon.